welcome to the end of 2021. What a year it's been, hasn't it? It's funny to think that when I was in my last years of education at the tail end of 2012, that my class was being informed that the most destructive overreach of Tony Blair was the erosion of our freedoms and the creation of the CCTV Society. A documentary, whose name now eludes me, broke down the ways in which this man had systematically destroyed those freedoms that we previously held dear in the UK, or at least we'd taken for granted. You would think that a generation wise to such things would offer more resistance. Across the decade, we have not only eroded the bedrock of our civilization to a wavering, uncertain sediment with small and uncertain pockets of strength, but we've also handed out the shovels to speed up this process. 2021 is a year of earnest shoveling all on its own. Governments globally have embarked on a mission to strip citizens of rights and to treat the, ironically enough, symptoms of a wider problem rather than the root cause. The UK allowing international travel en masse and encouraging widespread illegal migration with the aid of the French authorities appears to disregard COVID-19, a mild respiratory infection, as a serious threat. At the same time, this bureaucratic behemoth attacks everyday life with extreme measures such as vaccine passport proposals, over-testing, and believes it's not going far enough, all of which is taking place whilst they flout their own rules. The conflation in wider society of this new batch of vaccines with the wave of vaccines that curbed smallpox, polio, and other serious such plagues has been a farce. The inventor of the mRNA technique has himself stated that the method of action is insufficiently tested to allow such enormous human trials. Whatever you personally may think of the vaccine, its effectiveness or otherwise, it is undeniable that the moral panic that has overtaken society is horrific and overstated. My grandparents physically recoiled at the notion that I had not been vaccinated, looking at me with fear, until it was explained that the vaccine does not prevent transmission, and that the risks to me personally of damage or long-lasting complications like myocarditis were more than the risk of the disease itself. None of this information has been discussed. There is no balanced narrative accounting for age. There is no balanced narrative accounting for comorbidity. The official advice to administer this treatment to children is also an insanity, with medical professionals deeply divided over the ethical implications of experimenting on the young to prove the viability of this technique. I say it this way because they are not at risk from the disease. Businesses and public services appear to have forgotten that any other disease except COVID-19 exists. Indeed, I know of several people who are not willing to risk COVID infection when visiting grandparents without tests for everyone involved, yet they were willing to bring a cold into a house with the elderly and impaired family members. Paranoia about COVID-19, which is a risk to the frail, but no paranoia about other conditions which bring the risk of bronchitis to a 77-year-old diabetic. I'm not advocating for common cold passports, mind, or tests for them, but it is curious to observe the pedestal upon which this new disease has come to rest, and how similar risks in other areas of life are ignored because of it. The obvious solution, without all of this dramatic lockdown, show me your papers, arrest people for not wearing a mask nonsense, would be to increase bed capacity in the hospitals. Far more effective than a £37 billion test and trace failure that every public servant I've spoken to has been advised by their line managers to disregard, uninstall, avoid at all costs. There is a crisis in staffing in the NHS, as rightly minded professionals consider their relative risk of COVID and choose to vaccinate or not, as their personal circumstances would indicate. Those heroes we were told to insipidly clap for at 8 p.m. every night, whilst the truth was a murky mix of overwrought hospitals on the brink and empty hospitals willfully keeping away people who needed treatment for far more serious conditions, have now been reduced to objects of scorn, merely for exercising their brains and making a deeply personal and now very costly decision, both for themselves and the NHS as a whole. Outside of the pandemic, its measures, and the overreaches of government, we saw the COP Climate Conference have our leaders announce lofty goals of global significance to save the planet. Whilst I don't really stand one way or another on the climate issue, seeing arguments on both sides with some validity, I do think that the overzealous actions taken by our governments will lead to some very disparate and counterproductive outcomes. The move to all-electric production by 2030, whilst the technology is known to be in its infancy, a technology that will produce cars that can last fewer miles, whose components are built using rare materials that we cannot easily recycle, or that are born of a sickening kind of labour in the depths of the African continent, away from prying eyes and sympathetic hearts, seems to me to be rash. They are placing a bet on a kind of innovation that will either pay off or catastrophically impact their own stated goals within the following decades. In politics at large, people appear consumed by polarisation. If England is doing something one way, Scotland must do it another. The Welsh must lock down harder. The politicking that is evident in these decisions, at least in the UK, rather than sound reasoning, disgusts me. Racial consciousness is on the rise again, actively encouraged by those who would consider themselves the contemporaries of equal rights activists. They are more akin to animals than irrational human beings in their zealous and outrageous commitment to driving wedges in between groups and wrenching them apart for their own good. All of this to the cheers of the media class. The trial of Carl Rittenhouse, a cut-and-dried case of self-defense, was boosted into a national scandal, with the President of the United States, Joe Biden, remarking that he wished Carl had been found guilty after the verdict came in. As they say, when America sneezes, the UK catches a cold. Where, then, is there cause for hope, perhaps even celebration? Those small, solid pockets of resistance that I might have mentioned earlier. They exist in fragmented communities across the nation, across the world, atomized like us all, scared perhaps, a little naive, but with a kind of cautious optimism, I hope. Many have chosen to ride the tiger, an adopted phrase from a controversial philosopher perhaps, but the meaning is sound advice. Remain abreast of current events, but refuse to engage with them unless they directly impact your day-to-day plans. This simple directive helps to remove the paralysis that many who are opposed to the current state of affairs feel. Grassroots movements like the Basket Weavers have also done well. Though still small in numbers, committed groups across the world have chosen to gather and talk, make friends, and some have entered into business together. I do hope it will continue to flourish and to build momentum. To any weavers listening, I encourage you to try to create new members this year, reaching out to your friends, family, colleagues, and more. We have also seen pushback against the most radical elements that are being taught in schools, now that the so-called normie mums have taken an interest. Whilst not a victory in itself, as the education system in its current form seems to me to be too far gone to be fixed, there seems an appetite for an alternative to the posed education system of today at every level. I strongly desire for alternate providers to appear, to educate, to bring back some sanity to the learning of men and women both. A short list of positives then, especially when lent against the overwhelming weight of the negatives this year, but this has been 2021. I cannot say what awaits us in 2022, but I do know that we shall make it stronger together. If you think I've missed anything in this video, do leave a comment down below, or if you think you have any solutions, then discuss them with your fellow viewers in the comments. I've been Not So Obvious, and have a great year.